Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that really tries to cut through the noise, and dig into the sources, everything from old chronicles to the latest archaeology, and pull out what actually matters. The idea is to help you get genuinely informed, maybe spark some of those aha moments, and, well, today, maybe even shed some light on a few big historical mysteries. And today, we're diving headfirst into one of the honestly most captivating puzzles from the Viking Age. What happened to the vanished Viking armies? Because when you think Vikings, names like Ragnar, Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, they just pop into your head, don't they? Figures of legend, really. They represent these incredibly powerful forces that carved out empires across medieval Europe. Their impact was huge, no question. But here's the twist, the thing that gets historians talking. What if I told you that some of their biggest forces, not just raiding parties, we're talking whole armies, after years of conquering, terrorizing kingdoms, setting up shop, they just seem to, well, vanish from the history books. It's not just a few guys drifting off. We're talking large numbers of experienced warriors.
You'd think they'd leave a clearer trail, right? So did they just, poof, disappear?
It is a fascinating historical shadow, isn't it? And like you said, these weren't small groups hitting the coast and running. These were organized, pretty formidable military units, often thousands strong. And yet the chronicles, which are usually quite detailed about their conquests, where they went, they often just go quiet about what happened to them in the end. It's frustratingly silent sometimes. So you're left wondering, did they run into enemies we just don't know about? Battles that never got written down, maybe somewhere off the beaten track? Or, did disease just rip through them? Something medieval sources wouldn't necessarily focus on in detail that could wipe out an army faster than any battle. Or maybe they just blended in, melted into the lines they conquered, stopped being an army, and just became people living there. So this deep dive, that's what we're doing, chasing those shadows. And we'll focus particularly on probably most famous case, the Great Heathen Army.
Yeah, that ambiguity is exactly why we're digging into this today. Trying to answer that big question. What really happened when these major forces faded from view? We'll be looking at historical accounts like the big one, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We'll critically examine archaeological finds, and there have been some amazing recent discoveries there, and we'll explore the different theories historians have put forward. It's a journey into how messy history can be, how even dominant forces can leave, well, surprisingly faint footprints sometimes.
And it really starts with getting the context right. Moving beyond that that sort of classic image of the quick, brutal Viking raid. Because while those raids definitely happen, they don't tell the whole story of the Great Heathen Army. That was something else entirely.
Absolutely. Most people probably picture, Lindisfarne, 793 AD, that infamous monastery raid. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is our main contemporary source, really painted a terrifying picture. Heathen men, it called them. A whole new kind of violence. But those weren't actually the very first encounters. Even earlier, back in 787 AD, there's this story of 3 ships of Norsemen showing up off the Wessex coast from a place called Herefordland. And when the king's reeve, his sort of local official, rode out to meet them, probably just trying to figure out who they were, maybe direct them to the king's town, they just killed him. And the Chronicle adds this really ominous note. These were the first ships of Danishmen, which sought the land of the English nation.
Yeah, that term Danishmen, it's interesting, isn't it? And potentially a bit tricky, as some scholars have noted. It might not just mean people from Denmark. It could mean specifically from Hatha-Sissel in Jutland, actual Danes. But Danish might have just been the Anglo-Saxons' general term for anyone from Scandinavia back then. Maybe Norwegians from Hurtland, or just Northerners. So even right at the beginning, there's a bit of fuzziness about exactly who they were facing. But what's clear is that these early raids, they mostly hit wealthy monasteries, isolated churches, easy targets, lots of portable loot, not much defense. They were essentially hit-and-run jobs. Land, grab the goods, sail away. Quick profit, minimal long-term plan.
Right. Though there were signs of escalation, for sure. Like in 840 AD, King Ethelwulf of Wessex got defeated when 35 Viking ships landed. And the Frankish Annals of St. Bertin talk about a big attack in 844 where Northmen emerged the winners plundering, looting, slaughtering, and controlling the land. But still, mostly about raiding, getting wealth. It wasn't really about sticking around long term. But that all changed, like completely fundamentally shifted, when the Great Heathen Army showed up.
Exactly. 865 AD, they land in East Anglia. And this was a total game changer in strategy. It wasn't about quick cash grabs anymore. This is a planned strategic campaign. The goal, conquest, occupation, taking over the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex. Their plan was to set up their own rule, really change the whole map of England, an invasion like nothing seen before.
And the scale of it, that's key to understanding its impact and eventually how parts of it disappeared.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle consistently calls it Maesel Hahin, here the Great Heathen Army, or just Maesel here, the Great Army, and that Old English word here, it's important. King Wine of Wessex, way back in 694, and defined here as an invading army or raiding party containing more than 35 men. He specifically set it apart from the Anglo-Saxon Furterd, which was more like a local militia, part-timers. So the chronicles were deliberately using here to say, this is big, this is professional, this is serious.
And it's fascinating because even though everyone agreed it was great, figuring out the actual size, well, that's where historians really debate. And it matters for how we think about their fate. You have the minimalist scholars like Pete Sawyer. He suggested maybe fewer than 1,000 men based on, how many guys could fit in a typical long ship, maybe 32 per ship, so 30 ships, less than 1,000. But then others, like Guy Halsall, they say there's much room for debate, but probably low thousands. And Richard Abels, another key historian, thinks the initial force might have been in excess of 5,000 combatants.
Wow, that's a huge difference. Less than 1,000 versus over 5,000.
It is, and it really changes how you explain where they went. A smaller army could kind of just melt into the population through settlement, leaving maybe just some place names. But 5,000 or more, that's a lot of warriors to just disappear. You need bigger explanations.
But whatever the precise number, and it probably fluctuated over the 14 years they were campaigning, with new arrivals and people leaving the message from the sources, is clear. This was seen as a totally unprecedented threat, different from anything the Anglo-Saxons had ever faced.
And the leaders certainly added to that feeling of a huge, almost mythical danger. The names usually linked to the Great Heathen Army are Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, or Hingvar and Ubba. The sagas, especially the tale of Ragnar's sons, spin this great yarn about them being 3 of the 5 sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, and that the whole invasion was revenge for Ragnar's death, thrown into a snake pit by King Ella of Northumbria.
It's an amazing story, pure Viking epic. Definitely makes for good reading.
It does. But this is where we need to be careful separating the sagas from the more contemporary historical records. The annals don't actually back up that specific revenge motive or even explicitly call them Ragnar's sons. The real historical reasons for the army coming together are probably more practical, found in what was happening elsewhere, especially in Francia.
Ah, right. The Frankish kingdom.
Exactly. This wasn't just a random bunch of warriors getting together. Many of these Vikings had been fighting in Francia for years. They got really good at exploiting the chaos there. Emperor Louis the Pious's sons were fighting each other, the kingdom was fractured, and the Vikings found that rich monasteries and towns on rivers were super vulnerable. Think about the raid on Paris in 845. They only left after getting a massive payout in silver Danegeld. It wasn't just raiding, it was basically large-scale extortion, and it worked really well for them.
So they were already experienced, had resources, knew how to run these big operations, use political chaos to their advantage. But then things changed in Francia.
Pretty much. By around 862, the West Frankish king, Charles the Bald, he started getting serious about defense. Fortifying towns, putting chains across rivers, building forts. It made those inland raids much harder, much riskier. And the monasteries learned too, moving their treasures inland or burying them. So Francia started becoming less profitable, more dangerous, which basically meant these big Viking fleets and experienced warriors were kind of stuck looking for new opportunities. And England, rich, less defended, politically fragmented, it looked like the next best bet.
The logical next target. Makes sense.
Exactly. England didn't have those same centralized defenses Francia was starting to build. And this also explains why the army was such a mix. The sources suggest it wasn't just Danes, there were Norwegians, Swedes, maybe even guys who'd been based in Ireland. It was like a coalition of veteran Vikings from all over coming together for this one massive goal. Conquer England, don't just raid it.
Okay, so we've got this unprecedented force formed out of veterans from the Frankish campaigns, landing in England with conquest on their minds. Let's talk about how that campaign actually unfolded, because the way they moved, the way they operated, that gives us clues about their ultimate fate and the start of this vanishing. It was a long haul, right?
14 relentless years, yeah.
Right.
From 865 to 878 AD, constant movement, conquest, adapting their strategy. It was incredibly calculated. They learned from past failures. They had been beaten badly in Wessex back in 851 by King Ethelwulf, so they avoided Wessex at first. Smart move. Instead, they landed in East Anglia in late 865. Rich kingdom, but maybe not as militarily strong as Wessex. They immediately made a deal, got horses from the locals in return for peace, and probably a hefty payment. Horses gave them mobility, crucial for moving inland. They spent that first winter in Thetford getting organized, planning their next steps.
And then they really started moving, systematically taking kingdoms apart.
Absolutely. November 866, they marched north, take York. York was the capital of Northumbria, a big trading center rebuilt on the old Roman fortress. They cleverly exploited a civil war going on there between two rival kings, Osber and Ella, played them off each other, then crushed them both. From York, they pushed into Mercia, took Nottingham in 867. That actually forced Mercia and Wessex to team up briefly. King Burgred of Mercia and King Ethelred of Wessex, Alfred the Great's older brother, besieged Nottingham. But it seems they couldn't break the Viking defenses. So in the end, the Mercians just paid them off to leave. You see that pattern starting the Anglo-Saxons, often trying to buy peace.
Paying them off just lets them move on and hit somewhere else, though, right?
Exactly. For the Vikings, it wasn't a defeat, it was just funding for the next stage. They regrouped, refilled their treasure chests. They went back to Northumbria in 868, put a puppet ruler, Ecbert, in charge. Northumbria was basically theirs now. Then, crucially, back to East Anglia in 869. This time, no deals. They conquered it outright. Famously killed King Edmund, who refused to submit. He became Edmund the Martyr, a huge symbol for the Anglo-Saxons. The army wintered in Thetford again, cementing their control.
And then they got reinforcements.
Yes, in 871, the Great Summer Army arrived. A fresh wave from Scandinavia, led by someone called Bagseg. This made them even stronger. And now, this combined force turned towards Wessex, the last kingdom standing. They fought Alfred the Great. Well, he wasn't king quite yet. His brother Ethelred was at the Battle of Ashdown. Bagseg was actually killed there. But even with that victory, the Vikings were still a massive threat. Alfred became king soon after when Ethelred died. And Alfred, very shrewdly, decided to buy them off, paid them a huge amount of Danegeld. He needed time to regroup, plan a better defense. It wasn't giving up, it was tactical.
So the cycle continues. Wintering somewhere, campaigning somewhere else.
Pretty much. They wintered in London in 871-872, took tribute. Then back up to York, probably dealing with a rebellion against their puppet ruler there. Then to Torksey and Lindsey for the winter of 872-873, continuing to chip away at Mercia. Then they finally subdued most of Mercia, kicked out King Burgred, put in their own guy, Ceolwulf. Their next winter base was Repton in Derbyshire, 873. And it's here, after wintering at Repton in 874, that the Great Heathen Army, which had mostly stayed together for nearly 10 years, starts to split up. This splitting, this fracturing, this is really the beginning of the Vanishing Act we're talking about.
Right, the fracturing at Repton. This is where the single great army starts to dissolve and their paths diverge. This points us towards different kinds of disappearance.
Exactly. It split into two main groups. One group, led by Halfdan, who'd been a major leader all along, went north, back to Northumbria. He spent time raiding up into Scotland, fighting the Picts and Britons of Strathclyde. But then, crucially, in 875-876, Halfdan started formally sharing out Northumbrian land among his followers, letting them settle down, farm the land. This is the real start of large-scale Viking settlement, the beginning of what becomes the Danelaw. So for this part of the army, their disappearance is actually them becoming settlers. They didn't vanish, they put down roots.
Okay, so that's one clear path, settlement. What about the other group?
The second main band, led by Guthrum, Ostel, and Anwend, still a powerful force. They turned south, their target, Alfred's kingdom of Wessex. This was going to be the final showdown for this major chunk of the Great Heathen Army in England.
And this brings us to Alfred the Great making his stand. A really pivotal moment in English history, the thing that cemented Alfred's reputation.
It really was. Alfred, having bought that crucial time, fought back hard against Guthrum's army. It wasn't easy. There were lots of battles, skirmishes. Alfred even had to hide out in the marshes at Athelney at one point. That's where the famous story of him burning the cakes comes from. But it all led up to the Battle of Edington in May 878. And there, Alfred managed a decisive victory. He beat the Vikings in a pitched battle. It was huge, not just militarily, but psychologically for the Anglo-Saxons. It showed the Vikings could be beaten.
And Edington wasn't just a battle, it led to a political deal, right?
Yeah, a massive one. The Treaty of Wedmore came next. Guthrum, the defeated Viking leader, agreed to become a Christian. Alfred actually stood as his godfather at the baptism. And importantly, Guthrum agreed to leave Wessex. This was followed up by the more detailed Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. This formally drew the boundaries of the Danelaw, basically recognizing Viking control over northern and eastern England. It also set rules for trade and established the idea of weregild blood money, setting equal values for English and Danish lives, which is a huge step towards saying, okay, we have to live side by side now, even if it's tense. It acknowledged that England was now divided.
So a divided England. Vikings ruling the north, at east the Danelaw, with its own laws and customs.
Yeah.
Alfred and his successors holding on to Wessex in the south. A shift from invasion to, well, coexistence maybe. Uneasy coexistence.
Definitely uneasy, often violent, but yes, a shift towards settlement. The army, or at least parts of it, became the population of this new territory, swapping swords for plows, maybe, and for law codes.
So this idea of disappearance gets complicated. What happened to Guthrum's lot specifically?
We know their story pretty clearly. After Eddington and Wedmore, they moved to Cirencester in Mercia late in 878. Then in late 879, they moved into East Anglia. Guthrum, who took the Christian name Athelstan, actually ruled there as king until he died around 890. So that's a perfect example of an army's leaders, and presumably many of their men, just integrating, becoming rulers, inhabitants. They stopped being an invading here and became a settled people.
And presumably others from the original army settled elsewhere too.
Oh, absolutely. Many settled in Northumbria, especially around York, which became a major Viking hub. Some settled in Mercia. The archaeological evidence, like those Viking cemeteries at Repton and Heathwood in Derbyshire, we'll talk more about those, they strongly suggest, where large numbers of the army ended up burying their dead. So for a big chunk of this great army, the disappearance was really assimilation. They became Anglo-Danish, Norse-English. Their identity as invaders faded into a new, mixed culture.
Okay. But that can't be the whole story for everyone, can it? Especially if the army was really in the thousands?
No, definitely not. And this is where it gets really interesting, hinting at a more literal kind of vanishing act, at least from England. Remember that third group, the one that gathered at Fulham, near London, in 878.
Right. What happened to them?
Well, they didn't settle in England. It looks like Guthrum's defeat at Eddington might have put them off Wessex, made them think twice. But just as importantly, things were kicking off again in Francia. Emperor Charles the Bald died in 877. His son, Louis the Stammerer, died just 2 years later in 879. This created a huge power vacuum, chaos over the succession, and Vikings were always good at spotting an opportunity. So in 879, this army that had been waiting at Fulham just left England, sailed back to the continent to launch new campaigns there where things looked potentially easier and more profitable. So that's a clear case of disappearing from the English records, but simply continuing their activities somewhere else.
But incredibly, they came back eventually.
They did, or at least a large part of that force did. In 892, they returned. An enormous fleet, the Chronicle says 250 ships landed at Appledore in Kent and another 80 ships at Milton Regis. They clearly expected to find the same old, vulnerable England.
But Alfred had been busy making changes.
He really had. His reforms had completely changed the game in Wessex. This returning army found it much, much harder going. They couldn't make much headway against Alfred's strengthened kingdom and his new military system. So after about 4 years of trying, by 896, they basically gave up. They disbanded. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that the ones who were penniless, couldn't afford ships or supplies to keep raiding, managed to find boats and sailed south, back across the channel to the River Seine in Francia. So again, it wasn't necessarily that they were wiped out. It was more like a strategic withdrawal, a dissolving of the force, moving on to try their luck elsewhere.
These reforms Alfred made, they sound crucial. They didn't just win a battle, they changed the whole defensive landscape.
Absolutely, they were a game changer. And they directly led to later Viking armies either choosing to settle more peacefully in the Danelaw or just deciding England wasn't worth the hassle anymore. Alfred realized you couldn't just keep paying them off. You needed proactive defense. He built a whole system.
Starting with the Navy, I read he built new kinds of ships.
He did. He saw the standard Anglo-Saxon ships couldn't match the Viking longships for speed and maneuverability. So he ordered the construction of these new, bigger ships, supposedly twice as long, some with 60 oars or more. The idea was they'd be faster, more stable in rough water, and crucially, carry more warriors. It was a direct challenge to Viking sea power, trying to stop them before they even landed.
And on land, the fortified towns, the burhs.
That was probably his most significant reform, reorganizing the army and creating this network of fortified towns, the burhs. He often reused old Roman town sites, rebuilt their walls, made them strong again. These weren't just forts, they were safe havens for locals and livestock during raids and vital bases for the army, a whole defensive network.
How do they maintain them? And keep an army ready? The old militia system wasn't working, right?
Right. The Fyrd was too slow, too local. Vikings could raid and be gone before the Seard even mustered. So Alfred needed something more permanent. He set up this really organized system of tax and service laid out in a document called the Burgal Hittage. It basically calculated how much land was needed to support each burh and how many men each landowner had to provide for its defense and upkeep. The idea was that everyone lived within about 15 miles of a burh so they could get to safety quickly. It ensured the forts were always manned and ready.
And they needed roads to connect these places quickly.
Exactly. He created or improved military roads, the Heer paths, literally army roads. Remember, Heer meant the invading army, so these were roads specifically for moving troops against the Kyrmi. This whole system, the ships, the burhs, the standing army, the roads, it made that classic Viking tactic of grabbing a base and raiding out from it really difficult, especially in Wessex after about 884. It denied them the easy footholds they needed.
So Alfred basically made Wessex too tough a target, which forced the Vikings to either settle elsewhere, like the Danelaw, or move on entirely, like that group going back to Francia. It influenced where they disappeared to.
Precisely. It shaped their choices, making settlement or departure more appealing than continent difficult warfare in Wessex. It's a great example of how strategic defense can dictate the fate of an invading force.
Okay, so the historical texts give us this narrative of splitting up, settling, moving on, being pushed out by better defenses. But what about archaeology? Can digging in the ground give us more direct clues about these vanished armies? You mentioned Repton.
Repton is the star example, really. It's such a great story of science refining history. So at St. Wyston's Church in Repton, which was a big Anglo-Saxon church back then, archaeologists excavating in the 70s and 80s found this big D-shaped earthwork near the river. And under it, a mass grave.
A mass grave from the Viking era.
That's what it looked like. They found the jumbled up remains of at least 249 people, carefully arranged actually, with the long bones pointing towards a central stone coffin, though the body inside hadn't survived. And the skeletons were mostly male, mostly fighting age 15 to 45, about 80% male, exactly what you'd expect for an army. Plus, they found Viking stuff mixed in with the bones, swords, a Thor's hammer pendant. So the immediate thought was, wow, this is the Great Heathen Army. This confirms they wintered here in 873, 874, just like the Chronicle says. It seemed like concrete proof.
Felt like finding a smoking gun, but then science complicated things.
It did, initially. The first radiocarbon dating they did on the bones came back with dates spread over several centuries, which made people think, oh, maybe it's not a single mass grave from the army. Maybe it's just a cemetery used over a long time. It muddied the waters completely.
So the big aha moment came later.
Much later, yeah, in 2018, a team from Bristol University had another look, using newer techniques. And they realized something crucial. The Vikings ate a lot of fish. Seafood.
Okay, how did that affect dating?
It's called the marine reservoir effect. Basically, carbon in the oceans is older than carbon on land because it takes longer to cycle through. So if you eat a lot of marine food, the carbon in your bones looks older than it really is when you carbon date it. Once the Bristol team adjusted the dates to account for this high seafood diet, and it was a big adjustment, bang. The dates lined up perfectly with the late 9th century, right when the Great Heathen Army was known to be wintering at Repton.
Wow. So it was them after all. Science solves the mystery.
It did in this case. It confirmed a major burial event linked directly to this specific army, a huge win for archaeological science.
That's incredible. And there were other sites nearby too.
Yes, there's Heathwood. It's a cemetery with about 60 cremations. Now, cremation was really rare in England at this time. Anglo-Saxons buried their dead, inhumation. So finding a Viking Age cremation cemetery is highly unusual, and it's also strongly linked to the Great Heathen Army. It shows their distinct practices and another sign of their large presence.
But even with sites like Repton and Heathwood, archaeology doesn't explain everything, does it?
No, it often leaves us with more questions. These sites are amazing, tangible links. They show us large groups, periods of intense activity, burial customs, but they don't account for the total disappearance of armies that might have numbered many thousands. Repton has, 250 bodies. Heathwood has 60 cremations. That's significant, but it's not 5,000 warriors. These sites give us vital pieces of the puzzle, but they don't show us the whole picture of where everyone went.
Okay, so if archaeology gives us fragments, let's look at the main theories historians use to piece together this idea of disappearance. Starting with the most straightforward, they just lost. Military defeat.
Yeah, that's the simplest explanation. Vikings were tough, but they weren't unbeatable. They definitely took heavy losses sometimes. It's entirely possible that whole chunks of their forces, maybe even entire smaller armies, were just wiped out in battles that never got recorded properly, maybe ambushed by locals in some remote area, or big defeats that the chronicles just didn't focus on as much as Alfred's big win at Edington. History, remember, is usually written by the winners, the losers. Sometimes they don't leave much of a record, or their defeats get downplayed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does mention lots of smaller fights where Vikings were slain or routed, but often without details. A well-sprung trap in a forest could finish off 1,000 guys and barely made a footnote in the grand scheme of things.
And then there's the other big killer in medieval times, Disease.
Absolutely. Armies on the move, living rough, huge risk. Think about the conditions in their camps. Thousands crammed together, probably not great sanitation, maybe poor food supply sometimes, exposed to the weather, perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. Things like dysentery, which could dehydrate and kill quickly, smallpox, maybe even early forms of plague. These could sweep through an army and kill far more people than any battle. We don't often have specific records of disease outbreaks within Viking armies because, well, chroniclers were more interested in kings and battles. But we know from other medieval campaigns, like the Crusades, that disease was often the #1 killer. An army could just melt away from sickness, leaving maybe only mass graves like Repton, which, as we saw, can take centuries to understand properly.
Okay, defeat and disease. Grim possibilities. But then there's the less sudden, more gradual way of disappearing assimilation. Basically, they stopped being Vikings and became locals.
And this is probably the most common fate for many of them, especially the ones who settled in the Danelaw. Once they decided to stay, put down roots, farm the land, get involved in trade, things changed. They started marrying local Anglo-Saxon women. Over a generation or two, their kids grew up speaking Old English as well as Old Norse, adopting local customs, maybe converting to Christianity like Guthrum did. Gradually, that distinct identity as an invading Viking force just blurred. Their descendants became Anglo-Danish, or later, in Normandy, Normans, or in Eastern Europe, they blended into Slavic populations. Their Viking heritage left a huge mark. Think of all the place names ending in by or thorpe, loads of English words like sky, leg, anger, take. They all come from Old Norse. But the people themselves became part of the local fabric. It wasn't a physical vanishing, it was a cultural shift. Their numbers didn't necessarily drop, their identity just transformed. Like the Chronicle says, Guthrum's men settled down and shared out the land. That says it all, really.
Right. But Vikings didn't just operate in England and Francia. They went much further afield, into places where records are even scarcer. Could whole groups have disappeared out there?
That's another crucial piece of the puzzle. This accounts for a different kind of disappearance being lost in vast, poorly documented territories. Think about the Russell's Vikings in Eastern Europe. They traveled deep down those huge river systems, setting up trade routes from the Baltic all the way to Byzantium. Eventually, they were key in forming the state of Kievan Russes. Or think about the voyages west, Iceland, Greenland, even Vinland, North America. These were incredibly dangerous journeys into remote, often hostile environments. Communication was minimal, their own written records almost non-existent for a long time. Just surviving was tough. An entire expedition could be lost at sea in a storm. They could starve during a harsh winter in a place they didn't know. Or they could be wiped out in fights with local people, like the Skrælings they met in Vinland, who understandably defended their land. These clashes would likely go completely unrecorded by anyone who could write it down back in Scandinavia or England.
Like the mystery of the Greenland settlement just vanishing.
Exactly. While Greenland was a long-term settlement, not a mobile army, its disappearance shows perfectly how even large communities could just fade away. Lost to history due to climate change, maybe resources running out, conflict with the Inuit. We still don't know the full story. These groups venturing into the unknown become literal ghosts in the historical record. Their stories are just incomplete.
It really highlights how fragile things were, even for these famously tough warriors. Nature, disease, sheer distance.
Absolutely. For all their military power, Viking armies were still subject to the fundamental dangers and uncertainties of the medieval world. They weren't immune.
So, wrapping this up, thinking about these vanished Viking armies, it really underlines how much we don't know about the past and how a powerful force can fade in so many different ways. We've got clues, amazing science like the Repton dating, but clear answers for every lost warrior. Not really.
Exactly. We've got theories, wiped out in battle, decimated by plague, slowly assimilated into new cultures, or just lost to the elements in some far-flung land. For some, like Guthrum's group, we see a clear transformation into rulers and settlers. For others, like the army going back to Francia, it's a strategic move, continuing the story elsewhere. But for thousands of individuals, their final chapter is just missing, lost in the turbulence of the Viking Age.
And maybe that's part of the fascination, isn't it? That elusiveness. It pushes us beyond simple stories of conquest. It makes us think about the messy reality of life, death, success, and, well, vanishing back then. It makes you wonder about all those individual lives behind the numbers.
It really does. All those untold stories, the missing pieces, they whisper about countless personal fates lost to time, but they keep our curiosity going. So what does this tell you about power, about conquest, about legacy over the long haul. How can forces that seem so dominant leave such unclear footprints? And maybe, what kind of footprints are we leaving for the future to find?
That is definitely something to think about. If you found these Viking mysteries as intriguing as we did, make sure you join us again for more deep dives into history's forgotten corners and enduring puzzles.